You remember that argument goes as follows. If God exists, then pointless suffering does not exist. But pointless suffering does exist, and therefore God does not exist. Now, in responding to this objection, I think it's critical that we distinguish between what we might call the emotional problem and the intellectual problem. Pain and suffering in the world are undoubtedly a tremendous emotional obstacle to belief in God for many people. But that does not mean that it is automatically, therefore, a good intellectual objection to God's existence. However emotionally difficult evil and suffering might make it to believe in God, I'm convinced that it's not a good intellectual objection to God's existence. Well, why do I say that? Well, first of all, notice that Dr. Russell's objection depends, as he says, on the assumption that we have no good reasons to think that God exists. In his 1996 article, Dr. Russell admits that if we have good reasons to think God exists, then we have good reason to think that the evil in the world is not really pointless. So the suffering in the world is a problem intellectually only for someone who has no good reason to believe in God. But I've given 6 reasons to believe in God. And if these are good reasons, then Dr. Russell's argument can't even get off the ground by his own admission. But suppose I'm wrong about that. Suppose we have no good reason to believe in God's existence. Will Russell's objection still go through? Well, I don't think so. Why not? Well, in the first place, the second premise that pointless suffering exists is controversial. You see, we're just not in a good position to judge whether the evil we observe in the world is truly pointless. The philosopher William Alston, in his article, The Inductive Problem of Evil, lists 6 limitations on us which make it impossible to judge that God has no good reasons for permitting evil. Take just one of them. Our being limited in time and space. God's morally sufficient reasons for allowing some evil to enter our life might not emerge until centuries from now, or maybe in another country. When you contemplate our temporal and spatial limitations, I think you can see how hopeless it is for finite beings to speculate on the probability of God having a morally sufficient reason for permitting this or that evil that has entered their lives. And therefore, I think that the case of suffering is qualitatively distinct from our belief in the reality of the past. Alston concludes, and I quote, "It is impossible in principle for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil." But moreover, I think premise 1, under at least one interpretation, is not clearly true either. That is to say, the premise that if God exists, then pointless suffering does not exist. Maybe only in a world containing pointless suffering would the maximum number of people freely come to know God and find eternal life. I think that the reason that we think God would prevent pointless evil is because we think God, if he exists, is there to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. But on the Christian worldview, that's false. We are not God's pets. And the purpose of life is not human happiness as such, but rather knowing God and eternal life. And many evils may occur which are utterly pointless with respect to producing human happiness, but they may be justly permitted in view of God's overall purpose. Now, Dr. Russell might say, well, then they aren't pointless. They are morally defensible. But if that's what you mean by pointless, morally indefensible, that makes it all the more impossible to prove that these evils truly are morally indefensible if they serve God's broader purpose of bringing people to know him ultimately and to bring them to eternal life. My last point I'd like to make is that I think that evil paradoxically actually proves the existence of God. My argument would go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. That is to say, some things are really evil, therefore, God exists. Thus, although evil and suffering at one level seem to call into question God's existence, on a deeper, more fundamental level, they actually prove God's existence. So although the suffering in the world may constitute a significant emotional obstacle to belief in God, at the end of the day, I do not think that it constitutes a significant intellectual objection against God's existence.